With me today, I have a special guest, Professor James Densley. Dr. James Densley is professor and department chair of criminology and criminal justice at Metropolitan State University. Known for pioneering studies on street gangs, criminal networks, mass shootings, and policing, his research has been featured by global media and published in 70-plus scientific journals in 100-plus popular outlets. What role do you think peers or coworkers play in stopping violence early?
I think they play a huge role. It's about looking out for one another. And if everybody is trained on knowing what those warning signs of behavior change look like, if you know the signs and you trust the processes in terms of where to report and how to report, then there can be an intervention that can occur that could change somebody's life. It could change the trajectory of that person.
Another thing that's kind of along those lines that we get a lot of questions about too, and I'm just curious about your answer with this, is what makes a threat assessment team effective, and what do organizations commonly get wrong when they try to build one?
That's a great question. So threat assessment, behavioral threat assessment and management, is a process. I think that's the thing that we forget. And so with the process, you need the personnel wrapped around it.
And correct me if I'm wrong, James, it's pretty rare too to have two active shooters at the same time, correct?
Yes, it is quite rare. The highest profile cases would be something like...
Welcome to Iron and Empathy, the podcast where we explore what it truly takes to build strong, resilient teams in high-stakes environments. I'm your host, Drew Moldenhauer. Iron and Empathy is proudly sponsored by Blue Ethos Specialized Training, a national leader in workplace violence prevention, active threat preparedness, and de-escalation training. At Blue Ethos, we don't just focus on safety. We help organizations improve workplace culture by strengthening communication, increasing situational awareness, and creating environments where people feel supported, empowered, and prepared to intervene early before problems escalate. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's conversation. With me today, I have a special guest, Professor James Densley. Dr. James Densley is professor and department chair of criminology and criminal justice at Metropolitan State University, where I work as well, and co-founder of the Violence Prevention Project Research Center at Hamline University. Known for pioneering studies on street gangs, criminal networks, mass shootings, and policing, Densley has authored 9 books and edited 2 others, including The Violence Project, How to Stop a Mass Shooting Epidemic, winner of the 2022 Minnesota Book Award. His research has been featured by global media and published in 70-plus scientific journals in 100-plus popular outlets, including the New York Times, Time, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. Densley earned his doctorate in sociology from the University of Oxford. Thanks for coming on the show today, James.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, James, what got you interested in this line of research? And I'll just say that I have read your book. I listened to it on Audible, and I thought it was absolutely phenomenal. The Violence Project was great. And I'm just curious, and for all the listeners out there, what got you interested in this line of research?
I think it's a long trajectory of an interest in violent crime. And if I'm honest, it probably starts from a very young age, because my father was a volunteer police officer in the UK, and my sister was also a police officer. She had a 30-year career, most of which was in homicide investigation. And so you imagine growing up in that environment, casual dinner conversation was murders and violent crime and all these types of issues. And for a little while, I think I even contemplated, do I follow in the family footsteps and go into law enforcement? But instead, I went more into the kind of research and writing around those issues. And so, I was a sociologist in terms of my educational background. And if you know anything about a degree in sociology, it qualifies you to do everything and nothing. And so I had this sort of existential crisis there for a while of this was a subject I was so passionate about, but like, how was I going to translate that into an actual career? And how was I going to do something with this? And I stumbled into teaching. I actually was a school teacher for several years. And that experience of working with young people got me really, really interested in the dynamics of street gangs. Because some of the kids that I was working with were on the periphery of these groups and were getting involved in fights and violence and other issues. And it just kind of evolved from there, really, which was bringing together all these interests that kind of came forward to this point of, I'm really interested in understanding how people fall into, in some ways, a life of violence. And the Violence Project kind of was born out of those interests and it took on a life of its own, really, ever since, and continues to this day to be the main thrust of my research agenda.
Fantastic. And with your research, it shows mass shootings aren't random. What's the biggest misconception people still have about these attacks happening?
Yeah, so as I said, the Violence Project started life as a code name for a research project. And it was looking at the life histories of mass shooters in the United States. And we built a database documenting all aspects of their lives. But we also actually interviewed perpetrators who were incarcerated. We interviewed family members who knew them. We interviewed survivors, victims' families, first responders. We really wanted to come at this from that 360-degree perspective. And I think for us, what was one of the most telling things is these were individuals who perpetrated some of the most heinous crimes imaginable. Front page news, you knew some of these people from their reputation alone, if that makes sense. But before they ever became that monster that they're now known as, the interviews made clear that they were a human being living a normal life to some degree up until that point. And so the biggest misconception, to answer your question, is this idea that these individuals just kind of pop out of nowhere, that they are these monsters, these madmen, these evil people. At first, there is the humanity that's there. And somebody was somebody's son, somebody's brother, somebody's neighbor, somebody's colleague, somebody's classmate. So what didn't we capture at that time, what failed at that time, that they then went on to become that monster that perpetrated this horrific crime? So that for us was the biggest misconception. It was understanding what the human element of this crime was, that it didn't just come out of nowhere, that there was a pathway to violence, and that pathway was also a way of intervening and getting upstream of the issue.
And with that, when I was reading your book and listening to some of these interviews, how did you conduct those? Was this something that you guys would actually go to some of the prisons where they were at and you were interviewing there? Or was it a phone call, or how would you set these up just logistically? Because I always wondered that when you were doing some of these.
Yeah, it was a major undertaking. We got some funding from the National Institute of Justice, which is really what accelerated the project and enabled us to do it the way that we did it. And the original plan was to go into the prisons and do this in a sort of face-to-face capacity. We ran into some logistical challenges with that, as you probably could expect. I remember in one state in particular, which I won't name, but the person that had agreed to be interviewed by us was such a high-profile offender that the governor of the state stepped in and prevented us from speaking to them.
Wow.
We had to get levels of approval from the federal government and state government, and we had to, fill out all the ethical paperwork to do this. It was a major undertaking. And then COVID happened.
Oh.
So,
yeah.
In addition to doing this work, which already was really challenging, we then had to do it in even more challenging circumstances because the prisons were completely off limits. So the strategy that we ended up adopting was writing letters to the perpetrators and having them write lengthy responses back, and then conducting telephone interviews in between the letter writing process. And that ended up becoming a fascinating experiment of its own, because there's something about people's handwritten letters that are very intimate and very personal. and enable them to elaborate in a free-form way that perhaps they might not have done in a face-to-face interview. So we actually got a real glimpse into their psyche in some ways through the letters. But the interviews then we did with others, like survivors, first responders, victims' families, and so on, those were all conducted face-to-face. We actually traveled around the country, went to the communities where these tragedies had occurred. We spent entire weekends sometimes in the houses of these family members, going through baby photos and other things. I mean, it was really an intensive 2-year investigation doing that work.
Wow. And did you, for the most part, feel that the people that you did interview, were they willing to give that information and go into that kind of more, maybe they were feeling as a sense of healing, or they were getting that word out? Did you notice that, or was there more kind of pushback from a lot of people when it came to these?
There's a mix of things. I think for the perpetrators, there's certainly what you would call a selection bias, right? And it operates on multiple levels. So many perpetrators of mass shootings die on the scene. So you've already got a selection bias in terms of who's alive, right? And why? Why are they alive, right?
Right.
And then within that, you then have who is available to be spoken to, who's not got pending litigation and lawyering and all the other things. So those things shape the trajectory of the conversations and who you're able to talk to. Now, I will say for the families, what was really quite a striking moment for us was the work that we were doing started to get a little bit of media attention. And on the back of that media attention, other families started reaching out to us on their own, saying that they too had a story that they wanted to tell and that they wanted to meet with us and have that conversation. So what we found is that for some people, this was very cathartic. This was a moment where they were able to share a story perhaps for the first time. For others, I think they were still navigating their feelings around this and were, in some cases, a little bit guarded about the way they answered those questions and other things. And these are some of the methodological challenges with any qualitative research project of this nature. But this one took on so many different facets because of the different populations we were working with in the different circumstances we were doing so.
Yeah, and I guess that's stuff that I didn't even think about. Like you're saying, the pending litigation, they probably couldn't talk with some of them and setting up all those different interviews. But then you get kind of the chain reaction deal where people are hearing what you're doing and they're saying, hey, I want to share my story as well. So that's pretty interesting. Very cool. In your research, what seems to be the common theme about people that carry out these acts of violence? Is there something that you noticed when you were doing this research that it just kept coming back to 2 or 3 different things that you're like, hey, these are what we are finding in common with these people that are carrying out these horrific acts?
Yeah, we write about this in the book about a pathway to violence. And I think it's an obvious statement to say that anybody who perpetrates a mass shooting is not living their best life. You know, they're not there in their best self at that time. But when you peel back the layers of that thinking, you start to realize that these are crimes that are often rooted in an early childhood trauma that is unresolved. And that was something that really struck us, is several of the people that we interviewed had horrific childhoods growing up. They had experienced abuse, neglect, and again, this is not saying that that's causal, because there's millions of people around the world that experience traumatic childhoods and they would never go ahead and do something like this. But it was certainly something that was there and it was present in the lives of these individuals. The next stage along this is as they age, they reach a sort of identifiable crisis point in their life. And that crisis is often an overwhelming and existential crisis. It becomes a suicidal crisis, in fact. Many of these individuals get to a point in life they no longer care if they live or die. And that's the mindset that enables them to actually perpetrate a crime like this, because you don't get away with a mass shooting. It's not like any other type of crime. It's intended to be a final act. It's intended to be a spectacle. And some of that is rooted in the individual despair that gets you to that point to begin with. So you've got the crisis point that triggers this. That's where the grievances lie as well. These are individuals who are exploring a location for their shooting because it's somehow representative of a grievance that they have. So the crisis point is key. Thirdly, there's a script for this type of violence. And I know that sounds flippant to put it that way, but in our culture, in our society, we've scripted this form of violence. And it comes out in many different ways. It comes out in the active shooter drills that we run our children through in school. It comes out in the TV shows that we watch, the true crime documentaries. It comes out in the darkest corners of the internet where, mass shooters are heroized and celebrated in the true crime communities where people are copycatting other mass shooters. But there's this sense of, if I'm having an existential crisis, I'm going to do what most people do, and I'm going to Google it. I'm going to Google why I feel the way that I feel. And unfortunately, you go tumbling down that rabbit hole and you can become radicalized into violence. So that's another component of this. And then finally, the fourth piece is opportunity. And the opportunity factor is around people and places. So again, you're usually, by nature, humans are creatures of habit. They tend to target, they always say that you hurt the ones you love. Right. They tend to target the people and places they know best, the workplace, the school, and so on. But the other piece about this is opportunity in terms of access to firearms. And so it's that access to firearms that, it's usually during that period of time when they're in that state of crisis, they're thinking about accessing weapons, and that's when this goes ahead.
Okay, so just to recap that with what we were talking about, the common theme seems to be some sort of childhood trauma to begin with. So number one would be that childhood trauma. Number two was kind of that suicidal point or grievance point that they hit as they start to age. And then a script to follow kind of is researching other shooters, what they have done, looking at that script to follow through that. And then lastly is access to places, people, firearms to carry this out. That's kind of the common theme. Is that correct, James?
That would be it. Yes, that would be it. And it's a pathway that in some ways is linear, but, that you go through it in sequence. But at the same time, there's a lot of things happening simultaneously. But the important piece to recognize is all four of those stages are all intervention points. And I think historically, we only started to intervene at the very end. It was the opportunity piece. It was, how do we fortify our buildings? How do we protect our people? How do we restrict access to firearms? But what about all the stuff on social media before that?
Sure.
What about the crisis point? What about the childhood trauma? Could we have prevented this earlier? And I think the answer is yes.
Okay, and saying that, and I'll just kind of put you on the spot here, and I don't know if you have that information readily available, but even just talking that we're doing this podcast right now in Minnesota, and we just had a big national headlines with the Annunciation shooting. With the stuff that you looked into that one, was there these common themes in that one? Did you notice if there was any childhood trauma there, or obviously there was the suicidal point or that grievance point that this individual had, and then the script to follow? Did that kind of match up with that one?
Sadly, it did. And in fact, in many ways, the Annunciation shooting is almost a prototype for this type of a trajectory. There did seem to be trauma in this person's life, a grievance with the school site itself, perhaps related to their identity.
Okay.
As somebody who was in a sort of a process of transitioning as a transgender person. I think they were trying to figure out their place in the world, and they were struggling with some of that and struggling with the relationships around that as well. There were early warning signs in terms of their mental health that were there. And then really quite shockingly is the scripting of this particular crime, which was to say that they were pretty heavily immersed in the internet, looking at past shootings, even in some cases writing in their own diary about their preparations for this crime, the way they were planning the act, based on their knowledge of past shootings and of shooting practices. And then as well. They were practicing at the firing range and getting access to guns and starting to live out the fantasy of this particular crime before they ever perpetrated it. So sadly, the warning signs were there in this case. And I think that's one of the hardest things with this is you don't want to Monday morning quarterback all of this. And hindsight is a gift in some ways. But time and time again, we see those warning signs that perhaps weren't acted on. And the question often is, what could have been done differently to have prevented this crime, to get upstream of it? And I think Annunciation is one of those examples where if only we had intervened earlier, I think lives could have been saved.
And that leads me to my next question, because that's exactly what we're trying to do. Because I think especially with how serious these events are, I even get asked, by students or some people that we do presentations for, what's causing all this? How do we prevent it? I think there's just so many spokes kind of on a tire where there's just so many different things that are contributing to this, that where does your data show we have the greatest opportunity to prevent these violence before it reaches this crisis point? And where is it that, we work a lot, like you were saying, on the end stuff. We're going to run these drills. Here's some things that we can do in the aftermath. But really, how do we have that greatest opportunity to prevent these violence before it reaches that point, before it's acted out, do you believe?
I mean, this is the sad reality, which is I really sincerely wish we would get so far upstream of this that people would never get to that existential crisis point to begin with. So I would go all the way back to the early childhood trauma. I would even say, can we ensure that, parents are raising their children in a way where they feel loved and they're thriving and they're happy and they're getting all the support that they need? Could we do universal trauma screening, in hospitals and in schools, so that you could start to see those early warning signs that somebody was struggling in life? I would love to be doing that type of thing. Knowing the signs, we say when a person's in crisis, it's a change in behavior from baseline. So if the baseline behavior is that James is always angry, and then I come to work angry, that's not a change in behavior from baseline. It's just James is angry again. But if I'm somebody who was always the life of the party, the center of attention and happy-go-lucky, and then I come to work on Monday morning and I'm withdrawn, isolated, and don't want to be connected to my friends and colleagues, that's a change. Now, does that mean I'm going to be a mass shooter? No, of course it doesn't. But it does mean that out of compassion and care, somebody can tap me on the shoulder and say, hey, is everything okay? And it might be the opportunity to open up those conversations that can get you connected to the help and services that might get you off of that pathway. And a lot of what we've learned in suicide prevention is directly applicable, for instance, in this homicide prevention. Giving people a reason to live, a purpose, giving people the support that they need to get through those difficult times and difficult moments is central to violence prevention. So when I think about what we could be doing a better job at, it's getting earlier and more upstream on the simple things. And what I mean by the simple things as well is sometimes we don't know the impact that we're having with our words and actions. It can be the simplest and smallest things, little acts of kindness, get people through the day, and it gets them off of that pathway. So for me, that's where the action is. Doing more before you're in that ideation phase of really planning and going ahead and thinking about you're going to perpetrate this crime to begin with.
And so when you're talking about that, it's basically kind of like the title of this podcast is having, iron and empathy. And I always talk about, iron sharpens iron. We have to have accountability. We have to get better at what we're doing. But when we have these teams and we have society, that's great that we have accountability, but we always have to have a human side to things as well. We have to check in with each other. And I think that's more importantly nowadays than it ever has been, just with how we've gone through COVID. We've, distanced ourselves. Some people have isolated themselves. We don't get together as much anymore. I mean, I even look at our fantasy football drafts. We used to always get together. Now everyone's doing it from this virtual world, and we're not even having conversations anymore. And it's just a sad deal. So if I'm hearing you correctly, one of the things that we could do to help prevent this is really checking in with each other, whether that's a classmate, a fellow employee, family member, that maybe you're seeing a little bit of a behavior change. It's just, hey, how are you doing? I've noticed some things. How are you holding up? Is that kind of your approach that you're saying through the research that showed it?
That's exactly it. And actually, to use your terminology, if you think about the iron, right, the iron is about strength. And strength sometimes is about courage, right? It's about the courage to speak out, and it's about the courage to intervene when it's difficult. And I think that's the piece here that's so challenging, because so often people have a gut feeling that something's wrong, but they don't quite know what to do with that gut feeling. They're sort of like, oh, I don't want to get anyone in trouble, or I don't want to be a nosy busybody, or I don't want to say the wrong thing, and so they therefore do nothing, right? And it's a lot easier to do nothing than it is to do something. And doing something often takes a little bit of courage. So it is that combination of the iron, as you mentioned, that strength, with the empathy. Because I think at the end of the day, we're approaching this from that position of empathy, which is saying something's not right. I've got a gut feeling that something's off. I'm going to try and do something about this. And again, we don't necessarily do this always because you're trying to prevent a mass shooting. You do it because it's the right thing to do. If you're worried about somebody, you want to intervene, you want to do something about that. And that's why these systems are so important in workplaces, in schools, in churches, in community. As you mentioned, that human connection is really what keeps people alive. And it's that same principle that deeper into that pathway, it could end up preventing a terrible tragedy from ever occurring.
I love that. And, just talking about this, and he was interviewed by you and Aaron Stark. I just had a podcast with him, and he said, he was about ready to be a shooter. He even had the, like you said, the creature of habit. He had the mall where he was going to have it take place at. And he said the one thing that helped him prevent that from happening was his buddy Mike, that just showed up and was really nice to him and just treated him like a human being and showed that empathy with him and was just kind to him. And he said even after that, he had gone through some rough patches, and he was thinking about even ending his own life. And then his buddy Mike was there again too, and actually threw him a birthday party. And he said after that, those were the things that kept him alive. And I always tell people, we just don't know what each other's going through. We can go through some rough things, especially during the holidays and divorce and all these other things. And just checking in with people and just seeing how they're doing and showing those random acts of kindness can really help. And like you said, not even just preventing these things from happening, but just checking in can really help people out with those situations.
I think about it as well as sometimes when a mass shooting occurs, and let's be straight about this. These are some of the absolute worst, most horrific crimes imaginable, right? Young people murdered in their classrooms, parishioners gunned down in churches. They're unfathomable. They're unconscionable crimes, right? But when you think about what got somebody to the point of being able to do something like that, think about that, right? Usually in the media, they'll talk about, the search for motive.
Right.
And they'll talk about ideological concerns and whether or not this person was radicalized by a certain, terror group or something of this nature and everything else. But I take another step back and I say, yeah, but what gets somebody to a point where they find that stuff compelling to begin with?
Right.
Like, Drew, you and I are not on the internet searching like, why would this racism and hatred be compelling to me? It's not. The reason is because that person's not living their good life to begin with. It's all rooted in that individual despair. And so you think about the trajectory of somebody that gets to that point, they are in a point of their life where they no longer care if they live or die.
Right.
That's where they're at.
Right.
And their objective is to take as many people out with them. Right? That's the root. And you got to get to the root to solve the problem. So I look at that and I think, in which case, we've got to give people a reason to live.
I love that.
That's the answer.
Yes, absolutely, because they are getting to that point, like you said, and if you can get to that root beforehand to help prevent that and show some kindness, show some empathy, huge. And just because it's been so popular lately, and with these different events that we've seen recently in the news, anything that you can share about how the fatal shooting at Brown College or the deadly attack in Australia could have been prevented?
Yes, I mean, these are also really interesting cases for a couple of reasons. So the one in Australia is, to my mind, the first father-son duo with a mass shooting dynamic. And I think that alone changes the stakes on some of this, because what you are seeing here is a son that is quite likely to have been indoctrinated, radicalized, facilitated by their father. The power dynamics there, I think, are very interesting. And that particular crime does have this nexus with a sort of, anti-Semitism, terrorism, attacking Jewish people in a religious space, and so on. So that particular crime has these other dynamics that are attached to it in a different way, but at the same time, opportunity for prevention. So here's an interesting point here. Australia has some of the strictest gun laws in the world, but the gun laws are focused on the individual. In this particular case, you've got a father and a son. The father is the guy who had access to the guns. He just gave them to his son.
Right.
It's like a loophole that no one was thinking about in some ways. You also have this situation where this was somebody that they traveled to Syria and to the Philippines, before the crime occurred. Were there red flags there that were missed in terms of the radicalization process? That, when you're getting indoctrinated into this stuff, there is usually a trail of breadcrumbs left behind. That seems to be a space where there were some unanswered questions. So that particular case is a very interesting one and a global example that shows that this is not just a US problem. It is a global challenge, and often is rooted in the same sort of issues. Now, the Brown University shooting was also quite fascinating because the individual we thought was on the run afterwards. It turned out that they had taken their own life, and that it was then connected to other crime targeting another university professor. So again, it seems to be this case of a suicide turned outward to become a homicide, rooted in those same grievances and crisis points, but in this situation targeting a college and a university setting. So two different settings, two different countries, different dynamics, and yet some similar overlap. And again, I think that pathway to violence, those factors coming into play, and very relevant and very visible in those cases.
And correct me if I'm wrong, James, and I think the last research I've seen this, it's maybe a little bit outdated, but it's pretty rare, too, to have two active shooters at the same time, correct? Because again, correct me if I'm wrong, I thought it was 98 or 99% of the time it's a solo act. And the reason for that is because it's very hard to talk someone into doing one of these events. But I thought statistically with that, it's literally maybe less than 1% or 1% are carried out by two or more. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes, it is quite rare. The highest profile cases would be something like Columbine in the United States, and also the Thurston High School shooting just before that in 98. So you had two back to back actually in the late 1990s. And there's been some other examples. San Bernardino, for instance, with a husband and wife duo. So there have been some cases where there's a family dynamic or a friend dynamic involved in these cases. But the vast majority tend to be perpetrated by a sole attacker. And I think partly that might be as well because coordination makes it more likely that you are actually going to be caught. It's perhaps the issue as well. So there's in some ways the crime itself evolves when you've got that level of coordination, which can create opportunities for intervention. Like you mentioned, it can be hard to talk somebody else into doing something like this. Right. But it can also create opportunities, for failure in this sense as well. So, it's that particular case in Australia is really, really quite something.
And that's something that when we do our work and we go out and we speak to certain companies and churches and schools, is they do ask that question. Well, if we all run out of here, what if there's another shooter? And that's where we try to tell them to the best is, statistically, it's very, very rare to have two at the same event. Normally, you're looking 98, 99% of the time, it's a one person type deal that's carrying out this act. And with that, talking about the stuff, in many cases, someone noticed something beforehand. What role do peers and coworkers play in stopping that violence early? And I guess my question for that is, we have some new leaders that are listening to this podcast and maybe they just got promoted. It's the new year and they're starting to see that maybe they're running on a workforce shortage. So maybe they have to hire some people and maybe the background doesn't get done completely and they're running into some issues and they're not really sure how to handle one of these situations before it gets too big. So what role do you think peers or coworkers play in stopping violence early?
Oh, I think they play a huge role. I mean, the terminology often gets thrown around, being an upstander, not a bystander and all that sort of stuff. But, and that can sound a little trite and not really get the point across that we're trying to raise. But I think the idea is it's about looking out for one another. And if everybody is trained on knowing what those warning signs of behavior change look like, when you've got somebody who's demonstrating perhaps it's disgruntled behavior, or maybe it's disruptive behavior, or maybe it's even dangerous behavior within a workplace or within a school. If you know the signs and you trust the processes in terms of where to report and how to report, then there can be an intervention that can occur that could change somebody's life. It could change the trajectory of that person. And I think this is also important. It's not just about the personnel at the individual level. It is about the systems that you build around it. So often what you hear is, if you see something, say something. I often follow that up with, well, to whom?
Yeah, good
say
point.
Something to whom? And not only that, but what are they going to do when you've said something?
Right.
So what's the follow-up? Can you trust the process? You often hear some people will say, well, I don't trust the police, or I don't trust my boss, or I don't trust, my colleagues. That's where these systems fail.
Yeah.
It's all in trust. It's all in relationship. So if you see something, say something. Okay, so you say something. Is that an anonymous reporting system, or is it a structured reporting system? Then what happens next? Can you trust the process to not just approach this in a punitive way? Because that's where people get really reluctant to use it. If you're just going to punish people, they're not going to do it. You have to have people trust the process that it's going to get optimal outcomes. One of the biggest concerns in schools in particular is that you're going to criminalize somebody. You're going to unduly punish them. But this isn't a problem you can punish your way out of. You can't just suspend a kid and that's it, problem solved. You need a true intervention that's going to change, the behaviors. So you've got to trust the systems around it. So you're exactly right. The premise of your question colleagues and coworkers are so important because they are your eyes and ears. They are the interactions that you're having every day. They can notice the change. But then there has to be systems around them that they can trust, that can intervene and fill in the gaps where, they can't be there at all times and all moments.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, I think certain early intervention protocols, maybe having a peer support system too, where it's, hey, James and Drew, you guys are together. Your job is just to check in on each other, do that kind of stuff, check in, see how things are going. And you're starting to have these early intervention protocols that if something were a little bit off, like you were talking about with those behavior changes, or maybe just something's a little bit off, that James is now saying a couple things that he doesn't normally say. And he just went through a divorce. He was talking about some financial loss. I don't think things are right. Those kinds of things that you're starting to implement beforehand can really help those situations, and having those peers check in with each other.
That's exactly it. Yes. Because you want trusted individuals wrapping around you, really. And so, yeah, peer mentoring, peer support's vitally important, because you're only going to use these things if you trust the people involved in them. So I agree. I think that could be a really useful tool within a workplace to get people talking, get people acting.
Okay, and this is another thing that's kind of along those lines that we get a lot of questions about too, and I'm just curious about your answer with this, is what makes a threat assessment team effective, and what do organizations commonly get wrong when they try to build one?
That's a great question. So threat assessment, behavioral threat assessment and management, is a process. I think that's the thing that we forget. And so with the process, you need the personnel wrapped around it. I think of these things as being interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary. So in a threat assessment team, if you all are coming at it from the very same perspective, you might not realize the things that you're missing. So it's important to have different voices to be able to spot the issues when they arise. So you want a security, law enforcement voice, absolutely, very important. But it'll also be good to have a mental health practitioner speaking there. It might also be useful to have somebody who can be an advocate for the person we're talking about, that knows them well, whether that's another school teacher or a colleague, but somebody who understands that person, what's changing in their lives, what makes them tick, because they can provide some insight that you wouldn't have otherwise without those voices in the room. So I think about threat assessment as a interdisciplinary process, where it can't just be 5 cops in a room and they all agree with each other. Yeah. You need to have different perspectives, looking at this from different angles and thinking about what other interventions might look like. I've been part of building some of this in schools, for instance, and in a school, it's all very well having a teacher or an administrator in the room, but it's really important to have a counselor in there. It's really important to have a community outreach person in that room. It's really important to have a security or law enforcement voice in the room. You want those different perspectives because they can approach these problems from different angles and come up with different solutions.
That's a really good point. I never thought about that, but you're right. Having that advocate, having that law enforcement, having that mental health expert, when you have those different people in there, those counselors, then you're getting different viewpoints on things of how can we go about this and best approach it. Because you're right. If it was, and I'll say from 18 years of being a police officer, I see more of the punitive way, or, oh, hey, they broke the law. This is what, this kind of, but then there's a lot of gray area in there that you can have a discussion about. So I like how you're talking about with that threat assessment team, is putting that together and having a whole team approach where you're looking at it from multiple different angles. And I think people miss the mark on that sometimes. And it's just, we got to get rid of this person, or we got to turn them into law enforcement right away. If it's early enough, I think there's certain things that you can have discussions with that, where it doesn't have to be always this punitive approach.
I agree. And there's going to be times where there are HR processes that are necessary. Somebody maybe does need to be terminated from the workplace or so on. But you have to do that in a way that's not going to put the grievance back on the workplace. In workplace shootings, the most common through line is somebody who gets fired, who then pretty immediately goes back to the workplace with a firearm and attacks their former employers and former colleagues. So how do you manage those difficult conversations, human resources and so on, in a way that doesn't put the grievance back on the workplace? So there's lots of ways you can do that, with severance packages and support systems and different structures that do this the right way. But, so often it can be done hastily and without real thought process put behind it. That's where you see the problems arise. We've had cases in our data, for instance, where, the HR manager's absent on a given day. And so somebody else says, don't worry, I'll take care of it. And then 24 hours later, that employee who was fired by the non-expert is back in the building with a firearm threatening staff. That could all have been avoided if we had taken a step back and thought, how are we going to do this in a way that maintains the integrity and the dignity of the person, but also the safety and security of everybody around them, and really thinks through all the different consequences of the actions. It might take a little bit longer, but at the end of the day, it's going to get better results.
Absolutely. And with that, I think this is another one of those really good questions that when it comes to preparedness, we get this question a lot too, is how should organizations balance physical security with human focus prevention? And I like to tell people, and I'm just curious on your perspective on this, James, but I say, hard targeting is great. You can do that. You can put metal detectors. You can put bars on all this stuff. You can do all these other things, the film on the windows. But at the end of the day, the biggest prevention technique is just being a kind individual to each other and having a good workplace culture where you're checking in with each other. That's the biggest preventative measure, in my opinion, just with being prepared for one of these things to happen. Now, I think that, there's some hard targeting that you can do to just make sure that you're having some checks and balances, just like going to the airport. Obviously you have to go through those kinds of things, but curious what your perspective is on that when it comes to preparedness. How should organizations, do you think, balance physical security with human focus prevention?
Here's the thing that in some ways breaks my heart a little bit, which is I think in some ways it's a failure of policy, it's a failure of imagination and so on, that we put these decisions on the backs of our schools and on our workplaces, that they are compelled to have to deal with these really difficult balancing questions. It's not an either or, it's a both reality for workplaces. They have to be seen to be doing something. They have to try and protect their employees and their students and and everybody else. And so they're going to invest in infrastructure, metal detectors and everything else. The challenge with this, though, is our data are very clear about this. The vast majority of school shooters are school children. Workplace shootings, by definition, are perpetrated by current or former employees of the workplace. In college and university settings, shootings tend to be perpetrated by current or former students of the college or university. In places of worship, about a third of the time, it's a parishioner at that place of worship that perpetrates the crime. This is a trend time and time again. It's the human factor, which is to say, yeah, you've put in the metal detectors or the badge in, badge out, or the cameras or whatever it is that you've done to try and fortify the building. What that doesn't recognize is the fact that these are people who are walking in and out of that security apparatus every day. You need a key card to get in. Okay, I have one because I work here.
Right.
So that's it. Like that
right.
Security is done the minute
right.
it happens, right? So that's one piece about this is recognizing, as you mentioned, the human factor, which is to say, these are human beings who are in the building already, and they're walking in and out of. they're practicing the same active shooter drills that you are. They're going through them with you. So they are already familiar with that infrastructure. So if you're relying solely on the infrastructure, it's going to fail. Right. So the infrastructure can be very helpful in the event of having to lock a building down, and in a reaction and response scenario, that's where that action might be. But if you think of that as just solely prevention, it's not going to be enough. You have to get into the human factor first, recognizing that the grievances with the individual, the issues are with the individual. Let's prevent that from even happening in the first place. If we're just relying on the metal detectors, we've already lost because it's too late. And I will say one other sad reality is the analogy with an airport or with a secure building like a law enforcement building, for instance. There it can be met with equal force, right? If you're at the airport, there's airport police, there's TSA agents, there's everything else. In a school building, that's not the case. If somebody walks in and they're already firing an AR-15, the metal detector is not going to save you. So I think that's another piece of this, that it is helpful to a point, but you have to get beyond that and be thinking about the human aspect and building programs that account for both if this is to happen. But again, it's just sad that we live in a society where that is a reality. Like you have to be making those balancing decisions. I wish it wasn't the case, but that is where we're at.
No, I completely agree with you on that, and that's where we strongly always urge people too. It starts with that culture and what your culture is like inside of that school, inside of that, manufacturing place, and how are you treating your people and people first. But we get a lot of questions related to that. So I was curious to get your perspective on that. And I completely agree that it is a balance with that. And with that, what leadership behaviors help reduce violence risk and which ones unintentionally make it worse? So like we said, we have leaders in school buildings, we have leaders in manufacturing places. So what leadership behaviors help reduce violence risk, do you think, and which ones unintentionally make it worse?
Yeah, I mean, you use the word, and I think it gets thrown around a lot, and it's a word that's sometimes ill-defined, but I think it's the right one. You said culture. Culture is so important within a workplace, within a school, within a college, wherever it is. If you want to be somewhere, if you feel that you're treated with respect and dignity, and that you are truly part of the team and part of that place, you're not going to lash out violently against it. So it's about building a sense of belonging and investment within that space that is perhaps the most protective thing you could possibly do. So that's really where the leadership comes in. The leadership has got to set the tone for that culture. This is a place that is a safe space. It is a place where you feel like you belong, where you can be yourself, and where you can thrive. And I think when people are thriving, they're not contemplating violence on the scale. So it's again, it sounds so simple, right? Like you say it like this, and it sounds very hokey, and sit round the campfire and sing Kumbaya type of thing. But in some ways, it really is the essence of this. It's like, if you hate your boss, you hate your job, you hate everything about that building and everybody in it, you're much more likely to want to attack it. If you love your job, love your boss, love your colleagues, and love what you do, and you feel a sense of fulfillment and purpose, you're not going to violently lash out against that place. And so everything you can be doing to get that sense of belonging and connection and investment, it's going to pay dividends. And some of that is basics, some of it is, how you treat people in terms of their salary and benefits and, lunch breaks and all the boring stuff like that, HR processes. But sometimes it is just the simple things as well about how you build a culture where you feel a true sense of purpose and belonging in a workspace. And that really does come from leadership. It comes from the top, and it comes from the investments that are made. But here's another interesting thing about this. Not only is that stuff violence prevention, which is what we're talking about here today, that stuff is also recruitment and retention.
Right.
And if you ask any employer what's the most expensive thing to do, it's to recruit new people.
Right.
If you're bleeding staff because people don't want to be there and you have to continually be hiring, that's costing money. So the investments you can make in retaining talent, and people will stay if they're happy. And if they're happy, they're also not going to shoot up the building. Right?
That's a good point. Yeah.
So it's this sort of like broader HR strategy, if you will, about recognizing that violence prevention and security, right, is not separate from general workplace well-being and connection. The two are actually directly connected. I think they meet in different committees, and they're not in the same conversations, and they don't think of themselves as doing the same job, but actually they are heavily intertwined, because happy employees are non-violent ones, if you make that connection. And so everything you can be doing to put those two things together, I think, is really, really important. And again, going back to that point of trusting processes, right? If people feel invested in a corporation or in a company, and they feel like people are genuinely looking out for my well-being and they care about me, when they come at me, it's not from a place of disciplinary punishment, but from a place of concern and well-being. They're more likely to report when they've got a colleague that's, that they're worried about. And they're more likely to do the upstream things, the see something, say something stuff. It's all built into the culture of that institution.
I love that. And your ability to feel psychologically safe in those environments where you can speak up without feeling that you're going to get backlash big time, where you're not afraid to speak up about that. And I think that's such a huge part, that when you have a good leader, and I do this with my keynote speech, and I just say, tell me about the best boss you've ever had. Give me some attributes. And then I want you to close your eyes and I want you to think about that. How does that make you feel? And what kind of influence could that boss have on you? You would never want to disappoint them. But then I have people do the exact opposite. What's the worst boss you ever had? What kind of traits do they have? And now close your eyes and visualize what that feels like. And they always get this bad feeling. And then my learning point to all that is, now, if you're a leader in this room, what are your people thinking about when they picture you? And I think that's a huge point, just because it really starts to open some people's minds up as to that is the culture. And if you say you have an open door policy, but then you don't go visit your people, well, then what good is that, right? You got to have that influence. You got to walk the walk a little bit that way. And when you have that good culture, I think that's what prevents these things from happening. So,
and it's
very good points
as well. Like you mentioned,
yes,
seeing people, right?
Yes.
So how would you know if somebody's baseline behavior is changing if you never pay attention to them?
Right.
So there it is. That's exactly it. It's building the culture that facilitates the daily interactions that can actually serve as violence prevention buffers, without even realizing that they're even there.
Good point. Yes, absolutely. And after studying all these mass violence so closely, James, what gives you hope, and what's one change you wish more organizations would make right now?
I mean, there are certainly times where it gets very frustrating when you get trapped in political debates or, the whataboutisms on social media and all that type of stuff. But the truth is, what gives me hope is there are so many people working so hard to get upstream of this. And the fact that we're even having a conversation like this, talking about threat assessment and management in the workplace, and thinking about what are the ways in which you can build violence prevention proactively, that gives me hope, because that conversation is shifting and is changing. You know, if we were having this conversation 5, 10, 15 years ago, I don't think we'd be necessarily focused on those aspects. We'd still be in the mindset of, you know, these are just random acts that fall from the sky and there's nothing you can do about it because crazy people do crazy things, you know. And instead we were actually saying, like, well, no, there's a human connection here. And if we can get upstream of it, we can do something about it. So that gives me hope. You know, it is a landscape where so many people are investing so much time and resources and passion. That's exciting for me. And in some small way, I'm happy that our research can be part of those conversations. That, you know, I think we entered into this space, you know, almost a decade ago now, when we started doing this work, and there was still a lot of kind of unknown aspects to this work. And if in some small way, if our research has been able to answer some of those questions, to provide some data to ground decision making in terms of building out these systems, then you know, I'll be very you know, happy that we've been able to achieve that. And so there's still a lot of work to be done, but there's a lot of exciting things that are happening which you know, keep me hopeful.
I like that. Yes, absolutely, and I can't agree more with you. James, how can people follow your research or get in touch with you or read your books that you've written?
Yeah, well, we are connected with what's called the Violence Prevention Project Research Center. It's a bit of a mouthful, at Hamlin University. But our website is theviolenceproject.org, theviolenceproject.org. And access to all of our databases, they're all free to download. You can interact with them. You can use them in your own work. To do that, you can contact us directly through that page. And reach out to us, keep the conversation going. And then there's links there as well to access the book, which is available at all good bookshops, as they like to say, Amazon and so on and so forth. So, yeah, theviolenceproject.org is probably the easiest way to interact with our stuff.
And like I said before, I've had your book on Audible, and I thought it was absolutely phenomenal. On the car rides I would take into work every morning, I would listen to a couple chapters, and it was a great read. You had a lot of stuff in there with interviews and early intervention protocols. There was a lot of good information in there, so I recommend everyone take a look at that. So thank you, James. As we wrap up, I just want to leave with this thought. The research is clear. Violence is rarely sudden, random, or invisible. There are warning signs. There are moments where people notice something feels off, and there are opportunities to intervene long before a crisis occurs. Prevention doesn't live in metal detectors or policies alone. It lives in teams that trust each other, leaders who listen, and environments where speaking up is encouraged, not punished. Psychological safety isn't soft. It's one of the strongest tools we have to prevent harm. Whether you're a leader, a coworker, a parent, or a teammate, your awareness matters. Your willingness to care matters, and your decision to act early can change the trajectory of someone's life and protect countless others. Thanks for spending time with us today on Iron and Empathy podcast, and thank you, James Densley, for joining us on the podcast as well.
Thank you.